What if the smallest act of kindness you could offer, a gesture so insignificant you'd forget it by morning, was the one thing that could unravel a lifetime of lies? What if a few dollars, given freely from an almost empty pocket, could rewrite history and expose a secret buried for nearly 3 decades? For one waitress, a single cup of coffee changed everything. It set in motion a chain of events that would test the very foundations of her identity, forcing her to confront a past she never knew she had. This is a story about a simple silver locket, a heart-wrenching legacy of loss, and a test of character so demanding it could either shatter a young woman's spirit or forge her into the person she was always destined to be. The air in the daily grind was thick with the scent of stale coffee and fried onions, a perfume Alara Vance had long since stopped noticing. It clung to her uniform, her hair, her very skin, a constant reminder of the long hours and meager tips that constituted her life. At 28, she moved with a grace that belied the bone-deep exhaustion settled in her marrow. Her days were a relentless cycle. Wake before dawn, check on her mother, work a double shift, collapse into bed, and pray tomorrow's tips would be enough to cover the refill for the oxygen tank. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Resilience was a necessity. Her mother, Sarah, was her world, a fragile, beautiful woman whose laughter had been stolen by a disease that slowly, cruelly, tightened its grip on her lungs. The mounting medical bills were a silent, monstrous beast that lived in the corner of their tiny apartment, growing larger with every passing week. Alara navigated the cramped diner with an efficiency born of years of practice. She refilled coffee cups without being asked, delivered plates with a warm smile that rarely reached her tired eyes, and absorbed the gruff complaints of regulars with a placid patience that amazed her coworkers. She was a ghost in her own life, surviving but not truly living. Her dreams whittled down to a single, desperate prayer. Just one more day. Just enough to keep them afloat. On a Tuesday afternoon, during the lull between the lunch rush and the dinner crowd, he walked in. He was an old man, stooped and frail, wearing a threadbare coat that seemed too thin for the biting November wind. His face was a roadmap of sorrow, his eyes a pale, watery blue that seemed to look past the grimy tables and cracked vinyl booths into a world long gone. He chose a small booth in the back of Alara's section, a spot no one ever wanted, and sat with a stillness that was almost unnerving. Alara approached with her notepad. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice soft. He blinked, as if surfacing from a deep dream. "Yes, please. Black." She brought him the coffee, placing it gently on the table. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. He stayed for over an hour, nursing the single cup, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Alara watched him from a distance, a strange pang of recognition in her chest. It wasn't that she knew him. She knew his brand of loneliness. It was a quiet, profound ache she saw in her own mother's eyes on bad days, a sorrow that went beyond circumstance. Finally, he shuffled to the counter to pay. He fumbled in his pockets, his brow furrowing in confusion, then panic. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, but it was empty. He patted his coat again, a flush of crimson creeping up his wrinkled neck. I'm terribly sorry," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "I seem to have forgotten my wallet, or perhaps lost it." He looked utterly mortified, his dignity crumbling before her eyes. The owner, Mr. Henderson, a man whose patience was as thin as his hairline, shot a sharp, suspicious glare from behind the grill. "No wallet? Then how do you plan on paying for that coffee and the time you spent taking up a table?" The old man flinched. Alara stepped forward instantly. "It's okay, Mr. Henderson. I've got it." She reached into the pocket of her apron, pulling out the few crumpled bills she'd made so far. Money she'd been mentally allocating toward groceries. She smoothed out $3 and placed them on the counter. "His coffee is on me." Mr. Henderson grunted but took the money. The old man turned to Alara, his pale eyes shimmering with unshed tears. You didn't have to do that. Everyone has a bad day," she said with a small, genuine smile. "Don't you worry about it. You just have a better evening." As she spoke, his gaze drifted down to her neck, to the simple silver locket that rested against her collarbone. It was her most treasured possession, a gift from her mother years ago. The locket was smooth and unadorned, save for a tiny, intricate engraving of a starling in flight on its surface. The man's eyes widened, the color draining from his face. A strangled sound escaped his lips, and he reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering just inches from the locket, as if he were seeing a ghost. "Where?" he breathed. His voice choked with a sudden, raw emotion that stunned her into silence. "Where did you get that?" The question hung in the greasy air, heavy and strange. For the first time all day, the exhaustion fell away from Alara, replaced by a jolt of pure, unadulterated intrigue. The old man wasn't just looking at a piece of jewelry. He was looking at it as if it held the key to the entire world. And in that moment, in the middle of a dingy diner on a bleak Tuesday afternoon, Alara Vance felt the first, faint tremor of a life about to be irrevocably changed. A life she never knew existed was reaching out from the past, its first touch a trembling hand reaching for a silver locket. The next day, the diner was a carbon copy of the one before it. The same smells, the same cracked mugs, the same weary resignation settling over Alara as she tied on her apron. She had thought about the old man, his strange, visceral reaction to her locket, a puzzle she couldn't solve. It was a simple piece, a keepsake. Her mother had given it to her on her 16th birthday, saying it had been in their family for a long time. The photo inside was a faded, miniature portrait of Alara as a baby, chubby-cheeked and solemn. It was precious to her, a tangible link to a past she knew little about, but she couldn't imagine why it would provoke such a powerful response in a complete stranger. She dismissed it as the strange fixation of an old, lonely man and focused on the immediate task, surviving another shift. The lunch rush was a blur of motion and noise. Alara moved like a phantom, her mind on autopilot, until a sleek, black car pulled up outside. It was a vehicle so luxurious and out of place in front of the daily grind that it caused the entire diner to fall silent. A chauffeur in a crisp, gray uniform emerged and opened the rear door. Out stepped the old man from the day before. But he was transformed. The threadbare coat was gone, replaced by a bespoke cashmere overcoat the color of charcoal. Beneath it, he wore a perfectly tailored suit, his shoes gleaming with a polish that probably cost more than Alara's weekly earnings. He was still frail, but he stood straighter, his presence radiating an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. He was no longer just a sad old man. He was someone of immense importance. He walked into the diner, his eyes scanning the room until they found Alara. A hush fell over the tables. Mr. Henderson emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, his usual scowl replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. The man ignored him, walking directly to where Alara stood frozen, a coffee pot in her hand. "Miss," he said, his voice clearer and stronger than the day before, though still gentle. "I believe I owe you for a cup of coffee." He reached into his coat and produced a thick envelope, holding it out to her. Alara stared at it, then back at his face. "Sir, that's not necessary. It was just a few dollars." "Please," he insisted. "Your kindness yesterday, it was more significant than you can possibly know. Take it." Hesitantly, she took the envelope. It was far too heavy to contain just a few dollars. Her fingers trembled as she opened the flap. Inside was a stack of crisp $100 bills. She counted them quickly, her heart pounding against her ribs. There was $1,000. $1,000. Enough to cover her mother's medication for 2 months. Enough to fix the rattling heater in their apartment. Enough to breathe. I can't accept this," she stammered, trying to hand it back. Felt wrong, like charity she hadn't earned. "You already earned it," he said firmly. "Now, I have a proposition for you. It may sound unorthodox, but I ask that you hear me out." He gestured to the empty booth where he'd sat the day before. "May we?" Numbly, Alara nodded, sliding into the vinyl seat across from him. The entire diner was now pretending not to watch, their conversations resuming in hushed, curious whispers. "My name is Arthur Pendleton," he said, as if that should mean something to her. Alara didn't have time to follow the news or read business magazines. "I am a man of considerable means. I am also a man who has been living in a self-imposed exile for many years. An exile of the heart." His gaze was intense, searching her face. "Yesterday, when I came in here, I was at a particularly low point. I was revisiting a place from my past, and it brought back a great deal of pain. Your simple, unhesitating generosity was a light in a very dark place. But it was more than that." He leaned forward slightly. "The locket you wear. It is identical to one I gave my late wife, Lillian, on our first anniversary. An artisan in a small village crafted it for her. I have never seen another one like it. Not in all these years." Alara's hand instinctively went to her throat, her fingers closing around the cool metal. "My mother gave it to me. She said it was a family heirloom." "I see," Arthur said, his expression unreadable. "I find myself in need of a personal assistant. The duties would be unconventional. It would involve organizing old papers, photographs, archives. Things I have not had the strength to face for a long time. But more than that, it would involve companionship. Simply being there. The salary would be substantial. More than enough to ensure you and your family would never have to worry about money again." Alara's mind reeled. A personal assistant? To a billionaire? It sounded like a fantasy. "Mr. Pendleton, with all due respect, I'm a waitress. I have no experience as an assistant. I don't know the first thing about organizing archives." "I am not looking for experience," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "I am looking for character. I am looking for the kind of person who would pay for a stranger's coffee with her last few dollars. Your character is your qualification. I saw it yesterday. It is a quality rarer and more valuable than any line on a resume." Hope, the feeling she'd suppressed for so long, began to bubble up inside her, fierce and terrifying. Was this real? Could this be the answer to her prayers? A way out of the crushing debt? A way to give her mother the care she truly deserved? But suspicion quickly followed. Why her? Was it really just about a single act of kindness? Or was it about the locket? There was a desperation in his eyes that went beyond a simple need for an assistant. He was searching for something, and he believed she was connected to it. "I need to think about it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course," Arthur said, standing. He placed a sleek, minimalist business card on the table. It bore only his name and a private phone number. "The offer stands. Call me when you have made your decision." He gave her one last, long look, his eyes lingering again on the locket before he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Alara in a stunned silence, clutching an envelope filled with impossible hope and a head filled with unanswerable questions. The world she knew had just cracked open, revealing a glimpse of another, far stranger one, and she had been given an invitation to step inside. The decision was no decision at all. That night, as Alara sat by her mother's bedside, listening to the rhythmic hiss and sigh of the oxygen machine, she knew she had no choice. Sarah's cough had worsened, a dry, rattling sound that tore at Alara's heart. The doctor had mentioned a new experimental treatment, a possibility dangled just out of reach, its cost astronomical. Looking at the $1,000 on her nightstand, a fortune, yet a pittance against the mountain of their debt, Alara understood that Arthur Pendleton's offer was not just an opportunity. It was a lifeline. It was a chance to trade her exhaustion for her mother's health. There was no price too high for that. The next morning, with a trembling hand, she called the number on the card. A calm, professional voice answered. "Mr. Pendleton's office." "My name is Alara Vance," she said, her voice small. "Mr. Pendleton gave me his card yesterday." There was no hesitation. "Of course, Ms. Vance. He has been expecting your call. He would like to see you this afternoon. A car will be sent for you at 2 o'clock. Is that acceptable?" The efficiency was startling. It was as if her acceptance had been a foregone conclusion. At precisely 2 o'clock, The same sleek black car appeared outside her modest apartment building. Neighbors peered from behind curtains as Alara, dressed in her one good blouse and a pair of dark slacks, stepped inside. The car's interior was a world away from the cracked vinyl of the diner booths. It was silent, plush, and smelled faintly of leather and success. The city blurred past the tinted windows, the gritty, familiar streets of her neighborhood giving way to wide, clean avenues lined with gleaming skyscrapers. They pulled up to a building that seemed to pierce the clouds, a monument of steel and glass that bore the name Pendleton Tower in discreet silver letters. The chauffeur led her through a cavernous, marble-floored lobby to a private elevator. With a soft chime, it ascended, the numbers climbing at a dizzying speed. Her ears popped. The doors opened directly into a penthouse apartment that was less a home and more a private museum. The space was vast, minimalist, and sterile. White walls soared to a ceiling 2 stories high. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, godlike view of the entire city. The furniture was sparse and modern, more art than comfort. It was the home of a man who didn't live in his space so much as occupy it. Arthur Pendleton was standing by the window, his back to her. He turned as she entered, his expression soft. "Alara, I'm so glad you came." "Mr. Pendleton," she said, feeling small and out of place. "This is incredible. It's just a space," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "A gilded cage. Please, come." He led her to a large, empty room off the main living area. It was filled with dozens of sealed cardboard boxes, stacked high against the walls. A thick layer of dust covered everything. "This is your first task. These boxes contain my wife's belongings. Her letters, her journals, her photographs. I had them packed away after she was gone. I have not been able to look at them since. Not for 28 years. His voice was thick with a grief that was still raw, still present. Alara felt a wave of empathy wash over her. This wasn't just about archives. This was an act of archaeology on a buried heart. "I need you to go through them," he continued. "Organize them. Create a catalog. I need to know what is here. But I cannot do it myself." "I understand," Alara said softly. For the next week, Alara's life transformed. She would arrive each day at the penthouse, leaving her world of unpaid bills and greasy spoons behind to enter Arthur's silent, sterile palace in the sky. She worked diligently in the dusty room, carefully opening each box as if it were a tomb. Inside, she found the ghost of a vibrant, happy life. There were letters written in an elegant, looping script, filled with love and laughter. There were photographs of Arthur and a beautiful woman with kind, smiling eyes, Lillian. They were on a boat in a field of wildflowers, dancing at a gala. They were incandescently happy. As she worked, Arthur would often sit in a chair in the doorway, watching her, not speaking for hours. Sometimes he would ask a question. "Does your mother talk about your father?" he asked one afternoon, his voice startling her. Alara paused, a stack of Lillian's sheet music in her hands. "No. He left before I was born. She never speaks of him. I think it's too painful." "And the locket," he said, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. "Did she say where she got it?" "Just that it was a family heirloom," Alara repeated, the same answer as before. "She's always been very private about her life before I was born. It's like her history started the day I came home. A flicker of something, disappointment, frustration, crossed Arthur's face before he masked it. He was probing, gently but persistently, for a connection. Alara began to realize that her job wasn't just to organize these boxes. Her real job was to be a puzzle piece. He was trying to see if she fit into the gaping hole in his own life. The thought was both unnerving and strangely poignant. She felt a growing, inexplicable bond with this sad, wealthy man. She saw in his quiet sorrow a reflection of her own fears of losing her mother. They were two lonely people, orbiting a shared, unspoken grief. One rainy Thursday, deep in a box filled with baby clothes and silver rattles, her fingers brushed against a small, velvet-covered box. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, was another locket. It was identical to her own. The same smooth silver, the same size and shape. She picked it up, her heart thudding. She turned it over, and there, on the back, was the same tiny, intricate engraving of a starling in flight. She gasped, dropping the locket as if it had burned her. Couldn't be. It was impossible. She pulled her own locket out from under her shirt, placing them side by side on a dusty table. They were perfect twins. A matched set. Arthur, who had been standing silently in the doorway, walked slowly into the room. He looked at the two lockets, then at Alara's pale, shocked face. "I had two made," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "One for my wife, Lillian, and one for our daughter, Serafina. They were supposed to wear them together." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "My daughter. She died with her mother, in a fire at the hospital the day after she was born. Or so I was told." The room spun. A fire. A hospital. A baby. Vague, disconnected fragments of stories her mother had told her once, in a moment of feverish illness, swam in her mind. Terrible night. A miracle. A gift from God. This was it. The first true reveal. The reason she was here. Her locket wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a clue. It was a question mark that had been hanging around her neck her entire life, and Arthur Pendleton was the first person who knew what the question was. Her world, which had only just begun to stabilize, tilted violently on its axis. The revelation of the second locket hung between them, a tangible thing in the dusty air of the archive room. Changed everything. Alara was no longer just an employee, a kind stranger Arthur had taken a liking to. She was now inextricably linked to the central tragedy of his life. Her presence in his home, her very existence, now posed a question he had clearly been too terrified to ask for nearly 30 years. What if the official story was a lie? Arthur, seeing the shock and confusion on her face, seemed to gather himself, pulling back from the raw emotion of a moment before. "My apologies, Alara," he said, his voice regaining its composure. "I have burdened you with my history. It is a lot to process." "The fire," Alara said, her mind racing. "The baby, Serafina. You said she died." "That is the official record," Arthur confirmed, his tone becoming guarded. "Lillian and Serafina were in the maternity ward. A fire broke out late at night. It was chaos. By the time it was contained, we were told they were both gone. The grief, it broke me. I never questioned it. I couldn't bear to. But he was questioning it now. He had been questioning it from the moment he saw her locket in the diner. He hired her not just for her character, but as a living, breathing piece of evidence he needed to examine. The realization made Alara feel a chill. She was a project, a mystery to be solved. Did he care about her at all, or just what she represented? Before she could voice her unease, a smooth, confident voice echoed from the main living area. "Uncle Arthur? I trust I'm not interrupting." A man appeared in the doorway of the archive room. He was in his early 30s, handsome in a sharp, predatory way, dressed in a suit that was even more expensive than Arthur's. His smile was polished, but it didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He took in the scene. The dusty boxes, Arthur's somber face, and Alara, standing there looking disheveled and out of place, with a flicker of unconcealed disdain. "Julian," Arthur said, his tone instantly cooler. "I wasn't expecting you." "I have the quarterly reports," Julian said, holding up a sleek leather-bound folder. "I thought we could go over them. But I see you're busy." His eyes settled on Alara, raking over her with an insulting slowness. "And who is this?" "This is Alara Vance, my new personal assistant," Arthur said, his voice firm, a subtle warning in it. "Alara, this is my nephew, Julian Croft. He is the CEO of Pendleton Industries." Julian extended a hand to Alara, his grip firm and brief. It was like shaking hands with a marble statue. "A pleasure," he said, the words dripping with insincerity. "An assistant, you say?" An interesting choice. I wasn't aware you were hiring, Uncle. Our HR department is usually quite thorough. This was a personal matter, Arthur replied curtly. Julian's gaze fell upon the 2 lockets lying on the table. A brief, almost imperceptible tightening in his jaw was the only sign that he recognized them. He knew what they were. "Ah," he said, a note of mock sympathy in his voice. "Digging up old ghosts. Is that healthy, Uncle? It has been almost 30 years. Perhaps some things are best left buried." His eyes flicked to Alara again, and this time, there was no mistaking the hostility. He saw her not as a person but as a threat. "That will be all, Julian," Arthur said, his authority returning like a steel shield. "Leave the reports with my secretary. We will discuss them next week." Julian's smile tightened. "Of course, Uncle." "As you wish," he gave Alara one last look. A clear, silent message of contempt and warning. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Vance." Then he turned on his heel and was gone. The air in the room felt poisoned. Julian's presence had introduced a new, sharp-edged dynamic. He was the gatekeeper of Arthur's world, the heir apparent, and he saw Alara as an intruder, a gold digger preying on a grieving old man's sentimentality. The encounter left Alara deeply unsettled. "He doesn't like me being here," she stated quietly. "Julian is protective of the family's interests," Arthur said, though the words sounded hollow. "And he is ambitious. He looked at me like I was something he'd stepped in," Alara countered, a flash of her old, weary defiance returning. "He thinks I'm using you." Arthur sighed, the weight of the world seeming to settle on his shoulders again. "What he thinks is of no consequence. What matters is the truth." He looked at the twin lockets. "And I intend to find it. I've engaged a private investigator, a man I trust implicitly. His name is David Chun. He is already looking into the hospital records from that night. He's looking for any anomaly, any inconsistency. He's also trying to trace the provenance of the artisan who made these." Private investigator. This was real. This was a serious, high-stakes inquiry, and she was at the center of it. The hope that had buoyed her for the past week was now tangled with a growing sense of dread. Julian's animosity was a clear and present danger. He was powerful, ruthless, and he wanted her gone. She wasn't just organizing an old man's memories anymore. She had stumbled into a silent, bitter war over a vast fortune and a buried secret, and she was woefully unprepared for the battle. The path forward was no longer clear. It was shrouded in suspicion and shadowed by an antagonist who would stop at nothing to protect his claim. The days following Julian's visit were fraught with a new tension. Alara could feel his presence in the penthouse even when he wasn't there, a lingering chill of disapproval. She tried to focus on her work, meticulously sorting through Lillian's life, but her mind kept replaying the coldness in Julian's eyes. He had made it clear that she was an enemy. The thought gnawed at her. Was she doing the right thing? By helping Arthur chase this ghost from his past, was she putting herself, and by extension her mother, in danger? Arthur seemed to sense her unease. He became more withdrawn, spending hours on the phone in his study, the door firmly closed. The calls were with David Chun, the investigator. Each conversation left Arthur looking more strained, a knot of frustration tightening in his brow. The trail was cold, nearly 3 decades old. Records were missing, memories had faded. Alara's own life was a strange duality. During the day, she inhabited a world of unimaginable wealth and cryptic secrets. In the evenings, she returned to her cramped apartment, the scent of antiseptic and the sound of her mother's labored breathing grounding her in a much harsher reality. The generous salary Arthur was paying her had already made a world of difference. She'd bought the best medications, hired a part-time nurse for the hours she was away, and for the first time in years, the monstrous beast of debt seemed to be shrinking. She was trapped between gratitude and fear. The money was a golden chain, binding her to Arthur's quest, a quest that was becoming more complicated and perilous by the day. One afternoon, Julian appeared at the penthouse unannounced. Arthur was out, meeting with his lawyers. Alara was alone. She heard the private elevator chime and turned to see Julian striding into the living area, his expression one of smug condescension. "We need to talk," he said, forgoing any pleasantries. "I don't think we have anything to talk about, Mr. Croft," Elara replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Oh, I think we do," he said, circling her slowly, like a shark. "Let's cut the charade, shall we, Miss Vance? I know what you are. A classic grifter. You find a lonely, grieving old man, feed him a sob story, flash a piece of imitation jewelry, and suddenly you're his assistant. It's a tale as old as time." "You don't know anything about me?" Elara said, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "I know that a month ago you were slinging hash in a greasy spoon, barely able to pay your rent. Now you're living a fairy tale. I also know that my uncle has become obsessed with a ridiculous fantasy. A fantasy you are happily encouraging because it benefits you," he sneered. "He's vulnerable, and you are taking advantage of that. Your uncle is a kind man who is trying to find answers to a tragedy that ruined his life," she shot back. "Something you seem to have very little sympathy for." Julian laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Sympathy? This isn't about sympathy. This is about protecting my family's legacy from opportunists. My uncle built an empire. I run that empire now. I will not stand by and watch some nobody from the gutter waltz in and try to stake a claim based on a cheap trinket and a fairy tale." His cruelty was a physical force, pressing in on her. He was trying to intimidate her, to make her feel small and worthless, to convince her that she didn't belong here. And a part of her, the part that was still the tired waitress from the daily grind, was tempted to believe him. "I'm not trying to stake a claim to anything," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm just doing my job." "Then your job is over," he said coldly. He pulled a checkbook from his inner pocket, along with a fountain pen. He scribbled on it quickly and tore it out, holding it out to her. "Here, $100,000. A severance package. For you to take your sick mother and disappear. Go on a long holiday. Forget you ever met Arthur Pendleton. In return, you sign a non-disclosure agreement, and you never contact him again." Elara stared at the check. $100,000. The number was dizzying. It was more money than she had ever dreamed of seeing in one place. It could pay for the experimental treatment for her mother outright. It was security. It was a future. It was everything she had ever wanted. All she had to do was walk away. Walk away from the dust and the secrets, from Arthur's sorrow and Julian's venom. For a split second, she was tempted. The path of least resistance was so alluring. But then she thought of Arthur. She thought of his quiet, persistent grief, of the hope she saw flicker in his eyes when he looked at her. She thought of the two identical lockets. This was about more than money. It was about the truth. It was about a life that was stolen, a story that was forcibly silenced. To take this money would be to become complicit in that silence. It would be to validate every horrible thing Julian thought she was. Slowly, she lifted her head, her spine straightening. She looked him directly in the eye, her fear solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. Julian's eyes widened in disbelief. "Don't be a fool. This is the best offer you're going to get. Don't overestimate your importance here. You are a temporary distraction. I can make your life very difficult." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise," he hissed. "I can dig into your past. I can find things. Everyone has secrets, Miss Vance. And if I can't find any, I can create them. Do you really want to find out how far I'm willing to go to protect my family? The man you're trying to protect is the one who hired me," Elara said, her voice ringing with a moral clarity that surprised even herself. "He's searching for his daughter, and you're trying to stop him. Why? What are you so afraid of, Mr. Croft?" The question hit its mark. A flash of genuine fear, raw and unguarded, crossed Julian's face before he masked it with fury. He snatched the check back, his face contorted with rage. "You've made a grave mistake," he spat. "You will regret this." He turned and stormed toward the elevator, leaving Alara standing alone in the vast, silent room, her body trembling not with fear, but with a newfound, exhilarating strength. She had been tested. She had been offered a fortune to betray her own integrity, to abandon the quest for truth. And she had refused. In that moment of refusal, she ceased to be a passive participant in Arthur's story. She became its defender. The choice was made. There was no turning back. She would see this through to the end, no matter what Julian Croft threatened to do. The confrontation with Julian solidified Alara's resolve, but it also cast a long, dark shadow. He was not a man who made idle threats. She braced herself for a counterattack, but the days that followed were deceptively quiet. Julian didn't reappear. There were no menacing phone calls. The silence was more unnerving than an open declaration of war. Meanwhile, the investigation was hitting a wall. David Chun, the private investigator, had meticulously combed through the hospital's archived records. The official report on the fire was brief and conclusive. Faulty wiring in a utility closet adjacent to the maternity ward. The deaths of Lillian and Serafina Pendleton were ruled a tragic accident. There was nothing to suggest foul play. The paper trail was a dead end. Arthur grew more and more despondent. The flicker of hope that had ignited in his eyes was beginning to dim, replaced by the familiar haze of resignation. Perhaps Julian is right, he murmured one evening, staring out at the glittering city lights. Perhaps I am just an old fool chasing ghosts, trying to make sense of a senseless tragedy. Don't say that, Alara urged, her own conviction unwavering. The locket, it means something. We can't give up. Her faith seemed to give him a sliver of strength. David has one last lead, Arthur conceded. He found a list of all the nurses on duty in the maternity ward that night. Most are deceased or have moved with no forwarding address. But he located one, a woman named Carol Withers. She retired years ago and lives in a nursing home just outside the city. She was a junior nurse back then. It's a long shot, but she's the only living witness we have. A new surge of adrenaline shot through Alara. A witness, a direct link to that terrible night. We have to go see her, she said immediately. Arthur hesitated, a familiar fear in his eyes. He had spent decades avoiding the details of that night. To willingly walk toward them now was a monumental step. Yes, he finally agreed, his voice barely a whisper. We have to. The nursing home was a clean but cheerless place, smelling of disinfectant and regret. Carol Withers was a tiny, bird-like woman, her body frail but her eyes still sharp and alert. They found her sitting in a faded armchair by a window, a worn quilt over her knees. Arthur introduced himself and Alara, his voice gentle. At the mention of the hospital fire, a shuddered look came over Carol's face. That was a long time ago, she said, her voice thin and reedy. A terrible, terrible night. I try not to think about it. Please, Arthur implored, his desperation breaking through his composure. We need to know what you remember. Anything. No matter how small, he explained about his wife, Lillian, and his daughter, Serafina. Carol's eyes filled with a distant sadness. I remember your wife, she said softly. She was so beautiful, and so happy. She held that baby like she was the whole world. She paused, her gaze turning inward, back across the chasm of 30 years. It was chaos when the alarm went off. Smoke started filling the hallway. We were just trying to get all the mothers and babies out. It was procedure. Get them to the West Wing, which was isolated by fire doors. Was my wife with the others? Arthur asked, leaning forward. Carol's brow furrowed in concentration. I think so. But it was all a blur. People were screaming. Then I remember. Something strange. Strange how? Alara prompted, her heart pounding. There was another nurse, Carol said slowly. Her name was Agnes Miller. She was senior on the ward. A very stern, severe woman. Everyone was a little afraid of her. In the middle of the evacuation, I saw her. She wasn't helping the others. She was coming out of the nursery, and she was carrying a baby. But she wasn't going toward the evacuation point. She was heading the other way, toward a service exit at the back of the ward. "Did you see which baby it was?" Arthur asked, his voice tight. "No," Carol admitted. It was wrapped in a standard hospital blanket. But it was the look on her face. It was furtive, guilty. I called out to her, "Agnes, where are you going?" She just looked at me, a wild look in her eyes, and said, "This one needs air." Then she hurried off. It didn't make any sense. The safest place was the West Wing. A cold dread washed over Alara. A nurse taking a baby away from the evacuation route. "What happened to Agnes Miller?" Arthur demanded. "That was the other strange thing," Carol said, her voice dropping. "She never came back. After the fire, during the investigation, they tried to find her for her testimony. But she had vanished, quit her job, cleared out her apartment. It was like she just disappeared off the face of the earth. We all just assumed she was spooked by the fire and left town." Carol looked at Arthur, a dawning horror in her old eyes. "But now, you don't think?" She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. Agnes Miller hadn't been helping a baby. She had been taking one. The fire wasn't just an accident that Agnes had fled from. It was a cover for something else. This was the twist. This was the moment the narrative shifted from a tragic accident to a potential crime. It wasn't just a fantasy anymore. It was real. A nurse had taken a baby and vanished in the chaos of a fire. As they drove back to the city, the silence in the car was thick with the weight of the new revelation. Arthur stared blankly out the window, his face a mask of anguish and dawning fury. The grief he had carried for 30 years was transforming into something sharper, hotter. It was the rage of a man who realizes he hasn't just been a victim of fate, but of a monstrous betrayal. "Find her," he said to Alara, his voice a low growl. "Tell David to find Agnes Miller, or find what's left of her. Her family, her friends, anyone. I want to know where she went, and I want to know who that baby was." The hunt was no longer for a ghost. It was for a kidnapper. The stakes had been raised to an almost unbearable level. They now had a name, a suspect, and the first concrete piece of evidence that the story of that night was a carefully constructed lie. And somewhere, buried in the past, was the truth of what happened to the baby Agnes Miller carried out of that burning hospital. The truth that could either confirm Arthur's greatest hope or shatter his heart for good. The revelation from Carol Withers electrified the investigation. David Chen, energized by the new lead, threw all his resources into finding any trace of Agnes Miller. The woman had been a ghost for 28 years, but no one vanishes completely. There are always threads, however frayed, left dangling. While the investigator worked, Julian made his move. The quiet was broken. Arthur was summoned to an emergency board meeting for Pendleton Industries. The summons was unusual, bypassing Arthur's personal schedule and coming directly from the corporate legal department. When Arthur and Alara arrived at the tower, Alara now a constant, supportive presence at his side, they found Julian presiding over the boardroom, a smug, confident look on his face. He was flanked by the company's top lawyers. "Uncle Arthur, thank you for coming," Julian began, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "I'm afraid we have a delicate and serious matter to discuss. It concerns your new associate," he gestured dismissively toward Alara. "What is the meaning of this, Julian?" Arthur demanded, his voice low and dangerous.
"Due diligence," Uncle Julian replied smoothly.
He slid a folder across the polished mahogany table. "As CEO, it is my duty to protect this company and its chairman from any and all potential threats. That includes undue influence and exploitation. When you brought Miss Vance into your personal employ with a rather exorbitant salary, I felt it was my fiduciary duty to perform a background check." Alara's blood ran cold. This was it, the attack he had promised. "The results are troubling," Julian continued, enjoying the moment. "This is a lie," she said, her voice shaking with outrage. "I've never done any of these things. These are fake." Julian chuckled. "Are they? They look quite real to me. Forged by a top-tier firm." It's amazing what money can buy. Just as it can buy a personal assistant a very comfortable new life, he turned his attention back to Arthur, his expression now one of grave concern. Uncle, I know you've been through a lot. Your grief makes you vulnerable. This woman has clearly been playing on your sympathies. She saw an opportunity and she took it. She is a common criminal, a predator. She needs to be removed before she does any more damage. The lawyers murmured in agreement. The board members looked at Alara with suspicion and contempt. She was being framed, expertly and ruthlessly. Julian had followed through on his threat. He hadn't found a secret. He had created one. Arthur looked from the forged documents to Alara's face. He saw her shock, her hurt, and the fierce, defiant anger in her eyes. He saw the same integrity he had recognized in the diner, the same strength she had shown when she refused Julian's bribe. He had spent the last few weeks with her, watching her work, listening to her talk about her mother, seeing the profound kindness that radiated from her. He had to make a choice: believe the meticulously crafted lies of his ambitious nephew, or trust the gut feeling he had about this young woman. He closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. "I don't believe you, Julian," he said, his voice quiet but filled with absolute conviction. Julian's jaw dropped. "Uncle, be reasonable. The evidence is right there." "This is not evidence," Arthur said, his voice rising with a cold fury. "This is a despicable, cowardly attack. You have manufactured these lies because you are threatened by her, because you are terrified of what we might find. You are not protecting me. You are protecting yourself." He stood up, his frail frame seeming to gain strength from his anger. "Alara Vance has more integrity in her little finger than you have in your entire body. I have seen her character. I have tested it, and it is pure. Unlike yours." He turned to Alara, his eyes softening. "I am so sorry, my dear. I am so sorry he put you through this." Then he turned back to the stunned boardroom. "This meeting is over. And Julian," he said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper, "you have just made the biggest mistake of your life. You have shown me exactly who you are, and I will not forget it." He took Alara's arm, and together they walked out of the boardroom, leaving Julian standing amidst the wreckage of his failed coup, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. The walk back to the penthouse elevator was silent. Alara was still trembling, a mixture of vindication and lingering fear coursing through her. Arthur had defended her. He had believed in her, even when presented with evidence to the contrary. He had trusted his instinct, his judgment of her character, over his own nephew. Inside the penthouse, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving Alara feeling shaky and exposed. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for believing me." Arthur placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch paternal and comforting. "There was nothing to believe, Alara. I knew it was a lie the moment he said it. I know you," he sighed, sinking into a chair. "But this proves it. He is desperate. He is trying to stop us, which means we are getting closer to a truth he does not want revealed." The test had been brutal, designed to destroy her credibility and sever her connection to Arthur. But it had backfired spectacularly. Instead of driving them apart, Julian's attack had forged their bond into something unbreakable. It was no longer an employer and his assistant, or a grieving man and a mysterious girl. They were allies united against a common enemy. The moral test had been passed, and in doing so, they had both gained a new clarity and a renewed determination. The path ahead was still dangerous, but now they would walk it together, their trust in each other absolute. The hunt for Agnes Miller was no longer just about solving a mystery. It was about claiming justice. The aftermath of the failed boardroom ambush left an indelible mark. Julian's treachery had been laid bare, and Arthur's trust in Alara was now absolute. This new, solidified alliance gave them a powerful sense of purpose. The investigation into Agnes Miller intensified. David Chun, the investigator, was relentless. He discovered that Agnes had a sister who had died a few years prior. The sister had an estranged son, a man named Leo, who was living a quiet life as a mechanic in a small, forgotten town a few states away. It was a fragile, tenuous link, but it was the only one they had. Arthur decided he and Alara would go themselves. This was too personal to delegate. They drove for hours, leaving the gleaming metropolis behind for the Rust Belt landscape of forgotten America. They found Leo working in a greasy garage, a quiet, weary man in his 50s who seemed burdened by a life of disappointment. When Arthur mentioned his aunt, Agnes Miller, a guarded, resentful look crossed Leo's face. "I haven't seen her since I was a kid," he said gruffly, wiping his hands on a rag. "She showed up once, years after she supposedly disappeared, gave my mom some money and told her to forget she ever existed. Caused a huge fight. My mom always said Agnes was poisoned by secrets." "Did your mother ever say what those secrets were?" Arthur asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Leo shrugged. "Not really. Just that Agnes did something bad a long time ago for money, and that she was running from it her whole life." He paused, then seemed to make a decision. "My mom passed last year. When I was cleaning out her house, I found a box in the attic with Agnes's name on it. Mom must have kept it. It's just old junk, I think. Papers, books. I was going to throw it out." Alara's heart leaped. "Can we see it?" she asked, her voice breathless. Leo led them to his small, cluttered house behind the garage. From a closet, he pulled out a dusty, cardboard box sealed with yellow tape. He handed it to Arthur. "Here, you can have it. If it gets her ghost out of my family, it's yours." Back in the car, Arthur placed the box on the seat between them like a holy relic. Neither of them spoke. The weight of what could be inside was too immense. They drove straight back to the city, the box a silent, pulsating presence in the car. In the sterile quiet of the penthouse, Arthur took a knife and slit the tape. His hands were shaking so badly that Alara had to steady them. He lifted the lid. The box was filled with old papers, nursing textbooks, and a handful of faded photographs. But underneath it all were two crucial items. The first was a small, leather-bound ledger. Alara lifted it out carefully. She opened it. The pages were filled with neat columns of dates and numbers. It was a record of payments. The first entry was dated 1 week after the hospital fire. The payment was for $50,000. The subsequent payments came every month, for years in smaller increments. Beside each entry was a set of initials, E.C. "E.C.?" Arthur breathed. "Edward Croft. My brother. Julian's father." Alara felt a wave of nausea. Julian's father had been paying Agnes Miller for her silence. The conspiracy was deeper and darker than they had imagined. It wasn't just a rogue nurse. The Croft family was involved. Then, at the bottom of the box was a thick manila envelope. Inside was a stack of papers, filled with the spidery, agitated handwriting of an old woman. It was a letter, a confession. It was addressed to whomever finds this. Arthur began to read it aloud, his voice trembling. "My name is Agnes Miller. If you are reading this, I am likely dead, and the guilt I have carried for a lifetime has finally been released. I cannot go to my grave without speaking the truth of what I did on the night of the fire at St. Jude's Hospital." The confession poured out, a torrent of guilt and justification. Agnes wrote of her bitterness, her resentment of the wealthy families like the Pendletons who seemed to have everything while she struggled. She wrote of Edward Croft, Arthur's brother, approaching her. He was consumed by jealousy of Arthur's happiness and his new heir. Edward had a dark proposal. He wanted to ensure his own son, Julian, would one day inherit the Pendleton fortune. The plan was monstrous. Arthur read, his voice cracking. There was another woman on the ward, Sarah Vance. A young, unmarried woman whose baby had been tragically stillborn that same day. She was devastated, catatonic with grief. Edward's plan was to switch the babies, to give the Pendleton child to the grieving mother and let her disappear with her miracle baby. Then, to cover the tracks, to make it seem as though the Pendleton heir had died, a distraction was needed. Alara stopped breathing. Sarah Vance, her mother. "I was the one who started the fire," Arthur continued reading, tears now streaming down his face. Just a small one in the linen closet. Enough to cause chaos, to create a smokescreen for the switch. In the panic, I took the Pendleton baby from the nursery. I took her to Sarah Vance's room. I told her God had granted her a miracle. She was so lost in her grief. She believed me. She didn't question it. She just held the baby and wept. I gave her some money from Edward and told her to leave the city that night and never look back. The baby, who was tragically recorded as dying in the fire alongside Lillian Pendleton, was, God forgive me, Sarah Vance's stillborn child. Edward made sure the records were altered. He paid me for my silence for years. The room fell silent. The only sound was Arthur's ragged breathing. Alara felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Her entire life, her entire identity was a lie. The woman she knew as her mother was not her biological mother. Her father hadn't abandoned them. Her father was sitting right in front of her. His face a ruin of shock and dawning, miraculous recognition. She looked at Arthur and he looked at her. In his eyes, she saw the ghost of Lillian. The joy of a new father, the crushing weight of 3 decades of loss, and now, a fragile, impossible, incandescent hope. Serafina, he whispered, the name a prayer on his lips. He reached out a trembling hand, not for the locket this time, but for her. The truth was revealed. It was more shocking, more painful, and more profound than either of them could have ever imagined. Alara Vance, the tired waitress from the daily grind, did not exist. She was Serafina Pendleton, the daughter who was supposed to have died, resurrected from a tomb of lies by a single, simple act of kindness. The cascade of revelations was complete, and in its wake, 2 shattered lives were finally, impossibly, made whole. The weight of the confession settled in the vast, silent penthouse. It was a truth so monumental it seemed to warp the very air around them. Alara, Serafina, looked at the man across from her, the man who was her father, and saw 30 years of stolen time reflected in his tear-filled eyes. The questions that had defined her life, who was her father, where did she come from, were answered in one devastating, world-altering blow. Arthur slowly rose from his chair and walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, as if afraid she might vanish. Serafina, he said again, his voice thick with a lifetime of unshed grief and newfound joy. I never even got to hold you. Tears streamed down Alara's face as she closed the distance between them. She wrapped her arms around his frail frame, and he clung to her, a father embracing the daughter he had mourned for nearly 3 decades. It was an embrace that bridged an ocean of loss, a moment of catharsis so pure and powerful it felt like the world was being remade around them. They were no longer a billionaire and his assistant. They were a father and daughter, finding each other in the wreckage of a terrible crime. After a long time, Arthur pulled back, his hands on her shoulders. His sorrow had been replaced by a cold, hard fire. He knew, Arthur said, his voice a low growl. My brother Edward did this. And Julian grew up with this lie. He knew who you were the moment he saw you. His cruelty, his desperation to get rid of you. It was all to protect his inheritance. An inheritance built on a lie and a grave. The time for grief was over. The time for justice had begun. Arthur moved with a speed and decisiveness that belied his age. He called his most trusted legal counsel, not the corporate sycophants Julian surrounded himself with, but the old family lawyer who had known him for 50 years. He laid out the evidence. Agnes Miller's confession, the ledger of payments from Edward Croft, the testimony of Carol Withers. The case was ironclad. The climax was not a dramatic courtroom showdown, but something far more personal and devastating. Arthur called an emergency meeting of the Pendleton family and the highest-ranking, non-Croft-aligned board members. He held it not in the corporate tower, but here in the penthouse, his territory. Julian arrived, arrogant and defiant, clearly expecting another battle of wills. He walked in to find Arthur sitting at the head of a long table with Alara Serafina, seated at his right hand. The confession and the ledger were laid out on the table. Julian, Arthur began, his voice devoid of all warmth. I believe you have something to say to my daughter. Julian stared at Alara, then back at Arthur, a sneer playing on his lips. Daughter? Uncle, your grief has finally tipped into delusion. This is pathetic. I tried to warn you she was a manipulator. The manipulation, Arthur said, his voice dangerously calm, began 28 years ago. It was orchestrated by your father, Edward Croft. And you have been its willing beneficiary your entire life. He slid the ledger across the table. Your father's payments to a nurse named Agnes Miller, for services rendered. Then he slid the confession. And this is a full account of those services. Kidnapping, arson, fraud, the theft of my daughter's life. All so that you, his worthless son, could one day inherit what was never yours. Julian's face went pale as he scanned the documents. The arrogance drained away, replaced by the cornered, feral look of a trapped animal. He looked up, his eyes wide with panic. This is slander. Forgeries. This is her doing, he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at Alara. Is it? Arthur thundered, his voice echoing in the silent room. Tell me, Julian, when you saw her in the diner, wearing this locket? He gestured to the silver starling at Alara's throat. Did you feel a flicker of guilt, or did you only feel the fear of losing your money? It was the final blow, the direct question, born of a father's rage. Julian crumbled, his carefully constructed facade of power and entitlement shattered, revealing the craven, hollow man beneath. He did it for me, Julian finally screamed, his voice cracking. My father did it for me. You had everything, Uncle Arthur. The perfect wife, the perfect life. A child. He had nothing. I was supposed to have a chance. It was my birthright. The confession, bellowed in a fit of arrogant self-pity, sealed his fate. The board members looked on in horror and disgust. The family, his own cousins and aunts, stared at him as if he were a monster. In that moment, he wasn't a powerful CEO. He was just the pathetic son of a jealous man, his entire life exposed as a fraud. Security was called. Julian Croft, the prince of Pendleton Industries, was escorted from the building, his empire, his identity, and his future dissolving into ruin before his very eyes. The confrontation was over. The truth had won. The downfall of Julian Croft was swift and absolute. Faced with irrefutable evidence and his own damning confession, he was stripped of his title, his board seat, and his role in the company. Legal proceedings began immediately, not just for corporate fraud, but for his role in concealing the original crimes. The Croft name, once a pillar of the business world, became synonymous with disgrace. With the cancer of Julian's influence cut away, Arthur and Serafina, a name Alara was slowly, tentatively beginning to embrace as her own, could finally start to heal. Arthur's first act was to ensure Sarah Vance received the best medical care money could buy. She was moved to a private, world-class facility, where the experimental treatments that had once been an impossible dream became her reality. Alara sat with the woman who had raised her, holding her hand. He knows, Alara said softly. Arthur, he's my father, and he knows you saved me. Sarah, weak but lucid, wept silent tears. He gave you to me, she whispered, her voice raspy. That nurse. She said you were a gift from God. And you were. You were my miracle. There was no malice, no guilt in Sarah's heart. Only the pure, fierce love of a mother for the child she had raised. Arthur, understanding this, ensured she would be honored and cared for, not as a conspirator, but as the woman who had loved and protected his daughter when he could not. A week later, Arthur and Alara stood together in a quiet, manicured cemetery. They stood before a small, elegant headstone that read, Serafina Pendleton, beloved daughter, an angel for a day. I used to come here every week, Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. I would talk to you. I told you about my life, about how much I missed your mother. I never knew I was talking to an empty grave. Alara placed her hand on his arm. You weren't, she said softly. You were talking to me. Somehow, I think I heard you. They stood in silence, mourning the years they had lost, the life she could have had, and the woman, Lillian, who connected them both. It was a moment of profound sorrow, but also of profound peace. They were closing a chapter of lies and beginning a new one of truth. The phantom that had haunted Arthur's life was finally laid to rest, and in its place stood his living, breathing daughter. Justice had been served, not just on Julian, but for the memory of Lillian and the stolen childhood of Serafina. A few months passed. The autumn chill gave way to the quiet blanket of early winter. The city, viewed from the penthouse windows, seemed calmer now, less of a cold, glittering expanse and more like a kingdom awaiting its true heir. The penthouse itself had transformed. The sterile, minimalist spaces were now warmed by photographs, new ones of Arthur and Alara, and old ones of Lillian, finally freed from their dusty boxes. The scent of coffee often filled the air, a familiar, comforting aroma that reminded Alara of the journey's unlikely beginning. Alara Vance, the waitress, was gone. In her place stood Serafina Pendleton, a woman of quiet confidence and profound empathy. She hadn't simply inherited a fortune. She had inherited a legacy, and with it, a purpose. She took an active role in the Pendleton Foundation, redirecting its vast resources toward a new mission, providing world-class healthcare to low-income families, ensuring that no one else would have to suffer the way her mother, Sarah, had. Her first-hand experience with desperation gave her a perspective that no amount of business school could teach. Sarah's health had improved dramatically. The treatments were working. Laughter had returned to her eyes, and color to her cheeks. She lived in a beautiful, light-filled cottage on one of the Pendleton country estates, with round-the-clock nursing care and frequent visits from the two people who loved her most. One evening, Serafina and Arthur stood together by the great window, looking out at the city lights. The dynamic between them was easy, comfortable, filled with the quiet understanding of a lifetime of shared experience, miraculously condensed into a few short months. "Do you ever miss it?" Arthur asked quietly. "The diner? The simple life?" Serafina smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. "I missed the person I was learning to be there," she admitted. "The one who was strong even when she was exhausted. The one who hadn't given up on kindness." She looked at him, her eyes shining. "But I wouldn't trade this for anything. I finally know where I belong." This was the resolution. Not a return to the past, but the creation of a new future, forged from the truth. The wealth was not the reward. The reward was family, purpose, and peace. It was the quiet joy of a father and daughter, finally home. And so, the story closes not with the clang of a cash register, but with the quiet, steady beat of two hearts, finally healed. What began as a simple act of charity in a rundown diner ended in the reclamation of a life and the redemption of a soul. For in a world so often defined by what we have, is it not our capacity for kindness that truly defines who we are? If this story of hope, justice, and the incredible power of a single act of kindness touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more content that celebrates the best of the human spirit.